Professor Mary Schwartz, who is chairman of the Committee on Public Lectures and who has been introducing this fall faculty lecture series, is this evening in Washington, D.C., and asked if, in his absence as a member of the Committee on Public Lectures, I would introduce this evening's speaker. In a way, that works out very well because it was in a conversation between Professor Thomas and myself late last spring, that the idea of the series was first engendered. Professor Thomas' interest in Africa of long standing, following his PhD from Harvard University. He's been at UCLA since 1949, teaching and doing research in and on Africa. I discover he's made nothing less than 8 visits to Africa. Among these, a visiting professorship at the University of East Africa, at the University of Khartoum. He was a Ford Foundation Fellow doing research in East Africa in 1957-58. And his publications about Africa are many. Among them, I might mention two books, that is. One called Trade Routes of Algeria and the Sahara, and another called Transportation and Physical Geography in West Africa. The committee is indeed very honored to have Professor Thomas as its speaker this evening. One other thought I might mention: it's been in tradition of this lecture series that, to the extent that time and the energies of the lecturer and the audience permit after the lecture, we've indulged ourselves in an informal question and answer period, and will do so this evening. Professor Thomas' topic of the evening is natural resources and problems of development in the African continent. It's with great pleasure that I present to you Professor Benjamin Thomas.
Well, I think I am wired for sound now. Tonight I propose to take a broad view of the nature of African natural resources and consider some of the factors which are new in giving changed meaning to resources in the problems of nation building. We might note that natural resources are affected both by natural conditions, such as the physical and biological aspects of a new African nation, but also by the attitudes of the people who may use these resources, and by the political and economic conditions under which the resources can be developed. We therefore find that resources involves the idea of changing discoveries in a wide range of natural and social sciences. Dr. J. Russell Smith, formerly professor of economic geography at Columbia University, has described the problem of resources in this way. In the weighing of lands to determine their value to man, the geographer has had to change his scales every time science has put into his hands a new set of weights. One may even maintain that the concept of natural resources is a social, psychological, or philosophical one. That is, only things that a given people conceive of as being useful can be labeled as resources. And I believe it is obvious to anyone that a block of limestone in the Sahara, if there's no use for it, is not a natural resource. But if you wish to build a city nearby, it may become building stone, or if the country reaches the level of economic development where they want cement, it may furnish the raw material for a cement factory and be of great importance. Tonight, though, I propose to focus on what nature has provided in the way of potential opportunities on the African continent, and some of the ecological conditions which affect the use of natural resources. Sometimes it appears to me that a new African nation is in the position of a man who starts to play a card game. He has a hand of cards that he can use in the game, but with natural resources, the values of the cards keep changing, and there are a good many blank cards and also a few jokers. I propose to take a quick look at just 6 items. 1, minerals. 2, nature and transportation together. 3, climate and agriculture. 4, animal resources in Africa. 5, ecological factors and development schemes. And 6, a few ideas on the present and the future. First, on minerals, we find that the geology of Africa is of overriding importance for this particular resource. Most of Africa is a block of ancient rock, a plateau that has remained as a separate portion of the Earth's surface for a long period of time. Because of the structure of this interior part of Africa, there are only a few minerals that are found. The 4 main ones are gold, diamonds, copper, and iron. If we look over a map of Africa and consider how these minerals are distributed, we find that much of the gold is in the Republic of South Africa. The same is true of diamonds. There are other countries that have these resources in smaller amounts, but South Africa is primarily the big mining company so far as these 2 minerals are concerned. In the case of copper, though, we find that it is centered in the portion of the continent that lies a little farther north in this area. And of course, the production of copper has been a big item in the economy of the Congo and the former Central African Federation, especially the part that was northern Rhodesia, now is Zambia, since a day last week. Another item of importance is iron, and one of the encouraging features on the mining of iron is that as resources throughout the world become more scarce, people are turning to Africa, and iron ore is being mined more in Africa than at any time in the past. If we look at the sedimentary parts of Africa, that is the edges that have at one time or another been submerged, there are 2 other resources we consider. One is coal, of course, which is deposited under the proper conditions from organic material. And coal, again, is found in South Africa, along with other portions of the continent, such as some up here in Algeria, some in the Congo, smaller amounts in other places. The big interest in the edges of the continent, though, is in petroleum. So for the parts of Africa, such as this portion, which at one time was under a sea, lying farther south in the present Mediterranean Sea, we do have the possibility of discoveries of petroleum. Before World War II, the picture was not very encouraging. Egypt had some petroleum. Algeria had a little in this area, but neither one of these countries had enough so that they could have an export of petroleum. Since World War II, though, there have been a number of changes. In the case of Algeria, there have been some very important discoveries in this area, and petroleum, of course, is now being shipped out of Algeria, and it's become one of the important world producers. Libya is another country that has discovered petroleum in sizable quantities in recent years. This has made a big change for a country that is largely desert. I was once surprised, just after World War II, when I started studying Libya, found out that the major export of Libya was iron. And yet, surprisingly enough, Libya has no iron mines. Then I discovered that the junk left over from World War II, the old tanks and trucks and artillery pieces and so forth, when they were collected together and shipped out from Libya, provided a more valuable export than any other product. This has changed now. Until just recently, Libya was largely dependent upon subsidies provided by the United States with an air base at Wheelus Field and a British repair base in the east. But now, for the last 2 years, Libya has obtained more money from the export of petroleum than they have from the United States and Britain. They're able to go their own way without having to depend upon these military subsidies. There have been a few places south of the Sahara where petroleum has been discovered. For example, in eastern Nigeria. And although even though this doesn't rank with the major discoveries in North Africa, it is an area that's becoming more important, and it provides a source of income for the eastern province of Nigeria that formerly was dependent largely upon just exports of oil palm and related products. There are a few other places that have small quantities of petroleum, such as Angola, a little further south. If we look at the future then, we can say that there are still possibilities for discovering petroleum in North Africa and in other places around the margin of the continent. The Congo is already a favored area when it comes to minerals, but it might be observed that the lower part of the Congo, the portion in here, is one of the areas which the Belgians were mapping at the time of independence and which may contain petroleum. Still another mineral that can be of great importance in the future is bauxite, the ore from which aluminum is made. One of the requirements for processing bauxite is power, inexpensive power. We have the example of the Volta project in Ghana, which will make use of water power and develop the bauxite, which is in the same area. We might look, secondly, at natural conditions and transportation. Africa is a plateau continent, and in many places we find that some of the harder parts of the continent remain at a high level. Then there's a step, you come down to another level, still a third level, and so on. Of course, when rivers run from one plateau to another, rapids or waterfalls occur, and we find that every major river in Africa does have rapids and waterfalls. Many of you are familiar with the story of the Nile River and the cataracts, where you go upstream and come to the first cataract, the second, and the third. These are places where the Nile drops from one level of plateau to another. There are rapids in the Niger River in several places, and a whole series of very spectacular rapids in the Congo River through the Crystal Mountains, the southern part of the course of the river. There are also rapids further upstream that cut the river into segments. The same is true of the Zambezi with the famous Victoria Falls. These rapids and waterfalls, of course, provided obstacles to the penetration of the continent, that is, to the exploration as well as the early development. Something else also happens when rivers run from plateaus down to the level of the ocean. When the rivers run fast, they pick up material. When they get to the ocean and the water slows down, they drop material. This results in the development of deltas, such as the delta of the Nile River in the Mediterranean or the delta of the Niger in the Gulf of Guinea. In other places, If the currents are right, there are a series of sandbars that are developed. So one of the problems in using rivers has been these, in the past, has been these obstacles to navigation. There's still another feature of Africa which has caused trouble in the past. That's the faulted nature of the coast. That is, the margin of Africa, for the most part, is a straight line, a fault or a crack, and then the continent has been uplifted. This means that in most places the continent is a straight and regular one. In the early days, natural harbors were hard to find. Even when you found a stream, there were the problems of entering the stream and of passing around the rapids. However, I shouldn't dwell at this too long, because the modern view of transportation is that if the necessary resources are present, you can overcome these obstacles. As an example, the French in the early days used St. Louis at the mouth of the Senegal River, but as soon as the country was developed enough, they built an artificial harbor at Dakar, railways toward the interior. There has been more development on the ports of West Africa since World War II than the building that went on in all the period before World War II. So this is a very rapid move toward overcoming some of the problems on harbors. I might also point out that Africa is one of the areas where railways are being built in developing portions of the continent. In many other places in the world, of course, railways are being taken up. They are older areas where keeping railways is not justified. But in a new and developing area, if there's sufficient traffic, railways are useful and necessary. We have many examples in Africa. To go over some of the more obvious ones, just recently there's been a railway built in Mauritania from the iron mines out to the coast. A new harbor was developed in Ivory Coast, and a rail line extended on into Upper Volta. There's a railway now being built into northeastern Nigeria. Just before independence, a new link was completed to join up the rail system here so that rail traffic could move across this portion of Congo. Uganda built a railway out to a new copper mine, and Sudan has just recently completed lines running out to the west, another one down here to the south. There's another view we might take for the future also. The numerous waterfalls in a country like the Congo were an obstacle to early transportation, but now the Congo has rail links around these waterfalls so that there are rail lines that cross the Congo in several directions. A view for the future that may be important is that the Congo has the greatest potential water power of any country in the world. In order to have a great deal of water power, in order to have the physical conditions, of course, you need heavy rainfall and a great deal of drop in your rivers. And of course, the Congo, lying right on the equator, with all these tremendous rapids in the Congo River, has a very good situation with respect to potential water power. Another feature that is related to natural conditions and to transportation is just the matter of distance. One way of trying to measure how remote an area is to see how much gasoline costs. Many of you are familiar with the situation in the United States where you start to go up in the mountains and you find that the price of gasoline goes from 30 cents to 35 cents to 40 cents. So if we look at the western part of Africa, we can start in with gasoline costing about 40 cents a gallon if you convert liters, francs, and so forth to gallons and cents. About 40 cents here, about 60 cents here, then 80 cents, then $1. And I hunted for some spots out in the middle of the Sahara where I could pay up to $1.52 per gallon for gasoline. This illustrates a problem which has not been overcome, and that is that distance from the coast is a great economic handicap to the interior. Quite often a farmer in the interior of West Africa will put it this way: whenever I need something from the coast, I have to pay twice as much as someone does at the coast, because I not only have to get it to the coast and pay that price, but then I have to pay the cost of shipping it on toward the interior. So this is one disadvantage. On the other hand, if I have some cotton or peanuts in the interior and I want to ship it out to the coast, the price I can get, of course, is the price at the coast. So what I have to do is to pay this cost of transportation for the cotton or the peanuts before it gets out to the coast. So I have to sell it in the interior for perhaps half of what it's worth on the coast. Sometimes you can't export things at all. Some of the prices are even greater than this when it comes to interior costs. Something like cement may cost 4 times as much out in the Sahara as it does near the coast. I forgot this lesson once when I went to Timbuktu on a jaunt across the Sahara. I found an African who prepared meals for visitors, and he said that he'd be able to prepare a chicken dinner with some rice, local vegetables. I found this had cost me the equivalent of about 25 cents. Then he said, "What would you like to drink?" And without thinking, I said, "Well, what do you have beside water?" He said, "Well, we have beer." That sounded like a good idea. So I got a bottle of beer, which happened to be imported from Holland, which cost me $1.50. So you can imagine, 25 cents for all the meal except the beer because it came from local sources, $1.50 for the imported beer. It was Heineken's beer and it was worth it, I think. Now we might take a look at climate. Climate has intimate relationships with just about everything that people do in regard to grazing, agriculture, or in regard to health. So let's take a look at the climatic pattern first. I have a map that shows vegetation, but since vegetation is a good expression of climate, this will do. In the equatorial regions, you have a hot climate and moisture distributed rather evenly throughout the year. You end up with forest vegetation. To the north and south of the forested area, you have zones that get summer rainfall. So this zone, shown in yellow, has rain in the warmer season. It's dry in the cooler season because the rainy belt shifts to the north in the summer, shifts to the south in the winter period. The same thing happens down here: summer rain, winter drought. Then we have some monsoon winds that go toward Asia during the summertime, from Asia towards South Africa in the northern winter. This causes a varying condition of rainfall so that you get 1 or 2 periods of rainfall in most parts of East Africa. Therefore, the savanna belt extends north of the forest, along the east coast, south of the forest. The desert areas are found farther north in the Sahara, down here in the Kalahari and Namib, and then there are little strips of Mediterranean country, something like California, located in the far north and the far south. I propose to deal primarily with tropical Africa, so let's take a look at the forest and the savanna and see what some of the major products are. If we take the forest first, we'd naturally expect that people would be able to grow trees, other crops that are adapted to a hot, humid climate. One of the outstanding features of African agriculture, however, is that there are only a few products which can be grown in Africa and be sold on the world market. And for the forested area, after we talk about cocoa and oil palm and timber, there aren't any major products shipped from the forested area. If we look at the savanna area or the grassland, it has one big advantage over the forested area, and that is that it does not have the animal diseases of the forest. Therefore, cattle, sheep, goats, so forth can be kept. So we have animal products such as hides and skins from the savanna belt. And then, since this is an area in which grass normally grows, it's possible to raise grains for local food. But the only two products that have been developed for export to the outside world that are of great importance are cotton and peanuts. If we look at the mountain areas, these have a different form of climate. Often coffee will grow and other types of grains than those that are raised in the savanna. You'll probably note that by the time we put all of these together, plus the animals and a few dates from the Sahara, that we have a comparatively short list of products from Africa. There are many other products that are used locally. That is, a great variety of vegetables and fruit and so forth. But I'm talking now of commercial products that can be sold on the world market. One of the big handicaps of Africa is the type of climate. There is sufficient rainfall, evenly distributed in some parts of the forested area, but there are some disadvantages of soils here that cause trouble. And sometimes these are areas away from rivers, away from areas that have minerals that would justify the development of heavy transport facilities. If we look at the big part of Africa that has savanna climate and vegetation, we find that rainfall is not only unevenly distributed with a wet and a dry season, but also it varies from year to year. It's an undependable factor. One way of summarizing this is to say that Africa has no large area like eastern United States, from Illinois on over to Pennsylvania down to Alabama and Texas, which has a reasonable amount of rainfall, well distributed so that you can grow a great variety of products. Parts of Western Europe have such a climate, the same as the United States, but Africa has only spots here and there that would compare to this kind of an area. In talking about what can be done with agriculture, I might say that there is both an optimistic and a pessimistic view. I like the optimistic one myself, and that is that almost any place in Africa there are things that can be done to improve agriculture, to better the lot of the people. There are small things in many places that are practical and that are being done. The pessimistic part comes in that I don't believe anyone knows of a method for raising the standards of living to a great height for large numbers of people in an agricultural area like Africa. I just don't believe the answer has been found yet. My own view on this is that if the countries of Africa do what they can to develop exports, which of course does bring high income, but also keep working on the subsistence agriculture, the local products, there is much that can be done, and people should take heart from what can be accomplished rather than from what cannot be accomplished. Let's take a view now of animal resources. The savanna is an area with a great variety of vegetation. You start with almost a forest, run through many different kinds of combinations of trees and grass, finally get out to the edge of the desert where there are only a few low shrubs or weeds or scattered grass. This great variety of vegetation provides many different kinds of habitats. One result is that you get a great many herbivorous animals in Africa, those that live from grass and the leaves on trees, and then you get a great variety of carnivorous animals that feed on this first group. So Africa is a place that's noted for a tremendous number of antelopes, gazelles, and so on, and then animals like the lion, the leopard, the jackal, hyena, hunting dogs, and so on. One of the distinct features of Africa is that animals, the same as farm products, are related to natural conditions. And as people have developed areas in Africa, there's been a change in the balance between food and animals and the enemies of animals, and some surprising events have occurred. To take one example of sort of a changing ecological condition, we have the case of the man-eating lions of Tsavo over here in Kenya. The story is that a railway was being built. The British and the workers they had, Asians and Africans, killed off antelopes and other animals for food. Some of the other antelopes then just ran away, but lions don't frighten very easy. They stayed behind, had nothing to eat, started eating men. Finally, the man-eating lions were killed off all right, and this is one story. Another is that in West Africa, you have had farming people with rather intensive cultivation for a long time in places like Sierra Leone, southern Ghana, and Nigeria, so that these are not remote and wild areas, but rather farming areas where large animals are very rare. So we often find an African student who will go to school from, say, southern Nigeria to New York. People will ask him, "Have you seen any lions or elephants?" And he said, "Oh yes, I'm very glad I went to the Bronx Zoo yesterday. It's the first time I'd ever seen either." To take another case, you might look at Sierra Leone, an area that's been farmed for a long time. And one result of farming has been that just about all of the original forest has been cleared, and it's growing back in bush of different kinds. Originally, there was a great variety of animals, but some changes took place when people became either Muslims in the north or Christians in the south. One of the things they stopped doing was eating monkeys. There isn't anything in either religion that prohibits people from eating monkeys, but it just seems that when you become either a Muslim or a Christian, you stop. This is part of the cultural setup that goes along with the new religion. At the same time, since people were farmers, they didn't want leopards around, so they killed off leopards and other predatory animals that normally fed on the monkeys. So the monkeys had a very good situation. People no longer ate them. There were no longer any wild animals. There was all kinds of brush every place. We find that one of the big pests of Sierra Leone are wild monkeys. They're found just about all over. People have to go out on drives to get rid of the monkeys. However, the large animals of Africa are not the ones that really cause the problems. It's the small animals, mosquitoes, and tsetse flies. Probably most of you are familiar with the story of the mosquito. Of course, the mosquito has to live in a habitat which is provided by rainfall and vegetation. And the general story on malaria is that there's enough moisture for mosquitoes to breed the type that carry malaria, so that malaria is a problem in almost all parts of Africa. It's only when you get away from vegetation and water in the desert or some cold area up in the mountains that malaria is not a problem. There are many suppressives that have been developed, but malaria is still a very severe problem, most all parts of Africa. On the other hand, a different form of mosquito carries yellow fever, and both an inoculation and a vaccination have been developed when it comes to yellow fever. We now find that there are many African countries that have no deaths from yellow fever over a period of several years. So notice the great difference in the story of yellow fever being brought under control as compared to malaria. If we look at tsetse flies, we find that there are about 20 varieties in Africa, and these flies carry trypanosomes which cause disease. Sleeping sickness in humans is caused by a bite of the fly carrying the trypanosome, and the general story on human sleeping sickness is that the flies that carry the disease require denser bush and more moisture than the flies that carry the animal form of sleeping sickness. So human sleeping sickness has been a big problem in spots, such as Uganda, some of the more humid areas, The general story is that the battle against sleeping sickness in humans has been a difficult one, but sleeping sickness in humans has now been reduced to the place where the areas that have endemic sleeping sickness are only a small percentage of the areas that were included in the periods of the great plagues of sleeping sickness, the early part of this century. The story on Nagana, or animal sleeping sickness, though, is a different one. There are other types of tsetse flies that carry Nagana, or animal trypanosomiasis. These flies can live in a savanna climate as long as there is a reasonable amount of bush, a reasonable amount of moisture. They do not exist in the desert where it's dry or in the very dry parts of the savanna, and they don't exist in the mountainous areas. But one effect of the presence of tsetse flies and Nagana in Africa is that there is a tremendous portion of the continent which has no domesticated animals to speak of. That is, the forested areas and all the denser parts of the savanna, except the highland areas or the dry spots within the savanna. It's possible to deal with Nagana by clearing the brush, thereby getting rid of the tsetse flies, or by spraying, or by a number of other processes. But the general story is that it costs too much, and the answer that is developed is that the forested areas, the dense savannas, just do not have domesticated animals. If they keep domesticated animals such as cattle, horses, dogs, sheep, goats, camels, these animals are bitten by the fly, and the disease is almost always fatal. There have been some tremendous results of this form of, perhaps I should say, unresource in Africa, the tsetse fly. That is, that since animals could not be used for transportation, you have the story of the foot safaris in Africa, with people carrying burdens on their heads or on their backs for the people that wanted to penetrate toward the interior. There's another answer, which is a serious one in economic development now, and that is that you have tremendous areas that have sufficient grass for animals to graze in the forest and in the denser part of the savannas, but of course our domesticated animals cannot live in these areas. Still another problem is you cannot have mixed farming. That is, you cannot raise something like corn and feed it to domesticated animals because you can't keep the animals. This has a number of other consequences, such as that you do not have work animals to use to lighten the burden of the farmer in Africa. By the time you put these all together, the tsetse fly is a tremendous handicap to agricultural development in tropical Africa. Here's one way I might put it. There are more animals in the middle of the Sahara out here than there are in the middle of the Congo. Now, the Congo is an area with heavy rainfall, a great deal of vegetation. You know what the Sahara is like. And yet there are many more animals located right out here in the middle of the Sahara than there are in the middle of the Congo. So from the viewpoint of animal husbandry or grazing, the tsetse fly and Nagana is more of a problem than the Sahara is. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to many other aspects of development, just that one. A question that's come up recently is as to what can be done about the development of animal industries in Africa. A number of solutions have been developed, tentative solutions. Most of you are familiar with the story now on game parks in Africa, where some of them are threatened. But in a number of countries, such as Kenya, the income from people who come to hunt big game or to photograph wild animals or to just look at them in parks provides as much money as some of their secondary industries. I think there will be a change in attitude, and we'll find that wild animals will be kept in a good many parts of Africa in game parks or for hunting. There's another aspect, though, and this is to use animals for food. Often, animal ecologists wonder as to why we should get rid of the tsetse fly and introduce our domesticated kinds of animals when it might be easier to just use some of the animals that are already there. Many of the antelopes are bitten by the fly, but the disease has no effect of them. They are healthy animals, but they can spread the disease to other animals that are affected by means of the fly. An example of an animal that's often been discussed as a possible one for game ranching is the eland. The eland is a giant antelope, bigger than the ordinary cow. There are no particular difficulties in getting people to eat eland meat. People prefer beef, but it's somewhat like the situation in the United States where people will eat deer and elk and not especially worry about it as being a food that has a taboo against it. A number of people are working on the problems of domesticating the eland or in having game ranches for it. This would be only a partial solution, though, because the problems associated with trying to ship the meat out as an export are insuperable, but it does provide a local resource. There are probably several other animals. I just remember reading a few days ago about the attempts that are being made to use the hippopotamus for food. It's related to the pig. Many people in Africa eat hippopotamus meat. We have a number of places where the hippopotamus is increasing in numbers to where it's a problem. They have to start killing them off. One of the points I should throw in here now is that development in Africa not only involves all these natural and biological conditions that I've mentioned, but also the people. I'm not an economic anthropologist, or I could bring out a whole series of things regarding people that are very important when it comes to use resources. Obviously, if people prefer not to eat a certain animal or a type of food, you have a problem that has to be overcome. Likewise, if they have customs that are held by them to be more important than some benefit of health or of economic development, these are considerations that may be very important. Africans are just like Americans in this respect. It takes more than just a statement that cigarettes are not good for us to get people to stop smoking. And so you have these examples among peoples many places in the world. Let's try to put some of these ecological factors together. They're very complicated when you try to put the climate, the landforms, the vegetation, the soils, the diseases, the animals together. But the population map of Africa is sort of a summary of the resource use of the past in many ways. I'd like to point out on this population map some interesting features of West Africa. On this map, the areas with more dense population are shown in red or deeper colors, the unpopulated areas in white. If we start from the Sahara and go to the south, we have an almost uninhabited area, but surprisingly enough, many people think the Sahara is overpopulated. That is, the number of people in the oases and who are grazing animals around the edges are in greater number than what the Sahara can comfortably support. Going south of the Sahara, which has very light population, we come to a moderate population on the southern fringes, and then surprisingly enough, the population almost always drops off, becomes lighter as you go into still moister country. So if you look here, notice the color in this area and then the lighter color to the south. Notice that there are more people here in northern Nigeria than in central Nigeria, more people across the Sudan here than there are farther south. Professor Griffith the other day mentioned a middle belt in African history. There's also a middle belt in African geography. The explanation for this seems to lie in the total combination of ecological factors. We might say that this is a zone which has enough rainfall to be better than the desert. It has some advantages in soils. Usually places with lighter rainfall have better soils. It has the advantage over areas to the south in that it doesn't have enough vegetation so that it's bothered with the tsetse fly. So there are large numbers of animals that are kept in here, and there is enough rainfall so people can raise sorghum or millet along with some commercial crops like cotton and peanuts. If you go farther south, though, you lose the advantages of this area. The soils become worse because there's heavier rainfall. There are tsetse flies which spread nagana. You can no longer keep animals. You sort of have the disadvantages of the forested area and the drier areas put together. If you go still farther south, though, you get into some regions of better soils. They have the advantages of transportation I've mentioned, access to the outside world. They have more dependable rainfall. In many ways are more suitable areas than this middle zone that I just mentioned. Let's take a look now at ecological factors and some of the problems that colonial powers have had in the past in development schemes. I'll just take a comparison of two pairs of development schemes. The British were very successful in raising cotton in the Gezira area of Sudan. Gezira is located here, and in order to make this a very short summation, I'll just observe that the soils were generally good. The people were used to the type of farming that the development plan called for. The slope of the country was such so that the land could be drained, and an arrangement was made with the government and two private companies and the farmers who were to raise cotton in the Gezira that was satisfactory. We find that the Gezira is the #1 example of a successful development scheme in tropical Africa. The French had a similar plan. They were going to develop the Niger River. You might note that the Nile, the Gezira scheme, runs into somewhat the same kind of an area as the Niger does over here. In many ways, this seemed to be sort of a parallel development. The French invested a tremendous amount of money in putting in a dam on the river to irrigate an area here, and they hoped to produce or to irrigate perhaps twice as much land as the British did over here in the Gezira. It ended up, though, in being a project that produced about 1/10 of what the Gezira scheme did. To run through the series of things that went wrong, they had a number of drainage problems that were different from those in the Gezira. The people did not live in the area and have land tenure, but instead were people that were brought in. This created a number of different problems. Still another factor was that there were some diseases they hadn't counted on, that is, some pests. One of the things they discovered, which many entomologists had known before, was that in this particular part of Africa, when you provide more water, it results in a tremendous increase in locusts. So as they irrigated the fields, they provided a very good habitat for locusts. At the same time, they were providing areas for cotton. There were other pests, cotton diseases, and birds that caused them a great deal of difficulty. The problem of getting people to farm in the way that the French wanted them to, it would be no surprise to many anthropologists. It turned out that they just didn't produce cotton the way people did in Sudan. They turned to mixed farming, and that is to several crops rather than concentrating on cotton. They ended up producing rice, which was used locally. And even though the project is in operation, many people in Mali, the country where this project is located, believe that the $100 million or so that's been invested in the scheme could have been spent in many other ways that would have benefited the country more. Let's take a look at another two schemes, just to be fair to the French. You see, I had the British being successful and the French unsuccessful. So let's look at the French, and one of their great successes was the development of peanut production in Senegal. They started in near the coast. The people were adaptable to agriculture. The French solved a number of problems, such as hulling peanuts as they got farther from the coast, to get rid of the stems and the hulls, so they'd cut down on the weight by about a third. And Senegal now is a country that is well developed primarily because of this one product. After World War II, the British had a groundnut scheme or a peanut scheme for Tanganyika. And this had so many mistakes in it that almost anyone in any subject dealing with development can point out things that went wrong. The administrators can point out that Parkinson's law operated, that there were many more people working in offices than there were out on the scheme itself. Transportation people can point out a number of miscalculations that were made. I'd like to talk about some of the ecological conditions in the area itself. It looks as if this should be about the same kind of an area as Senegal. It's about the same distance from the equator, has about the same rainfall, falls into the same kind of a situation when it comes to vegetation. However, when they started in Tanganyika, they discovered that the soils had a great deal more quartz in them than those in Senegal. When they used heavy machinery, it packed the soil down so that it was hard, could not be worked. Another problem was that when they used sharp tools to disc or plow, the quartz acted as a grindstone, dulled the tools very rapidly. They also had some types of vegetation that were a surprise. These were just tough shrubs, but they found when they hooked their machinery onto some of these shrubs, the roots were so long and so tough that instead of tearing up the shrubs, they tore up their machinery. The introduction of cash wages to the local people caused havoc both politically among the Africans and economically. The English started out with local headmen and chiefs providing labor for them, but after a while the authority was no longer there. I think I'll stop at that by just pointing that almost everything went wrong with the groundnut scheme in East Africa. Many of these things were related to African conditions, that is, to peoples, to soils, to vegetation, and so on. One of the lessons that is obtained from a study of African economic history is that grandiose, large schemes, hastily thought up, are very likely to end in disaster or at least moderate failure. It has happened time and time again. On the other hand, there are a great many local things that can be done. It's often possible to start with a pilot project, and after you see how all these different ecological conditions are going to work out, it can be expanded into a larger one. Well, in conclusion, I might say it's my opinion that the African nations had a difficult time in gaining independence, but they have a bigger problem ahead of them. They have the opportunity to try to use resources to gain higher standards of living. This is an urgent problem, as Professor Whitaker pointed out when he talked about the politics of despair. But if people look at gradual and small gains in many places, I don't think that it has to be a pessimistic picture. Some of the encouraging features of the use of resources in Africa is that we have the lessons of economic history to go by. There's been the study of anthropology, which has developed enough information on many people so that we can avoid some of the mistakes of the colonial powers in the past. And the Africans, fortunately, are working on political problems, have control of their countries. It often turns out that there is a political prerequisite to economic development. For example, when people ask me what can be done on using the resources of the Congo, my answer usually is, I don't see how you can do anything until they have a government and an administrative system which will allow the country to function. So the main and first step to take for the Congo, it seems, is that of politics, administration, rather than something that would follow later. But in the way of opportunities in Africa, we can point out that the Africans now have a voice in their own government and that they are anxious to develop to a higher standard of living as fast as they can. This is a good feature as compared to some of the situations in the past. In the long view, some of the most depressing areas in Africa, I think, may turn out to have the best opportunities in the way of resources. The Congo is one of these. It's an area that's now suffering the bad features of Belgian rule in not providing administrators and a possibility of a changeover to a new African government that could function. But in defense of the Belgians, I'd like to point out that there are railways serving the major parts of the country. I always have a picture in mind of a ride on this newest railway in the southern Congo, which was the only modern, clean, air-conditioned train I rode on in Africa. The steamers on the Congo operated in very efficient fashion before independence. There are many minerals besides copper that I just haven't mentioned, and there's also the possibility of discovering many more. The Congo has an area up in here which produces gold and coal. The Katanga region has many minerals. In between, there's an area which the Belgians had not completed mapping, that is, for detailed geological mapping. And as soon as the Congo can sort out some of its political difficulties, this no doubt would be something to which they would turn. Another reason why I don't like to be too pessimistic about the use of resources in Africa is that I've been surprised many times in the past at what the colonial powers have done. To take one example, when I first started studying about the Ivory Coast, it was sort of a backwater area, but in the early 1950s, the port was opened at Abidjan. The railway was pushed on into Upper Volta. Ivory Coast is one of the few African countries now that has a comparatively well-balanced economy with the production of cocoa, timber, bananas, and coffee. This has taken place just during a very short time. I think that there will be failures in the future. I'm aware there's a long list of difficult economic problems to solve, but I do have confidence in the new African nations, and just as I've been surprised at what the colonial powers have accomplished many places, I expect to be surprised at the development that takes place in some of these new African nations. Thank you.
I wonder if there are questions, if you might hold up your hand.
The question is, what's being done to reconvert desert land to useful purposes? The only projects of which I'm aware are those in North Africa. Tunisian government is doing a number of things and making good progress. And in regard to this question of desert land, I might point out that there is a theory that is reasonably popular that the Sahara is expanding and that the forest is disappearing. In one way, I think this is true. Another way, I don't believe it is. If we look at climate, the amount of rainfall, there hasn't been any significant change for a good many hundreds of years. The French were embarrassed because for a while we had a number of hydrologists who were trying to explain why the climate was getting drier and why Lake Chad was drying up. But then when Lake Chad started expanding and getting more water in it, a great many of these people had to devise new theories to explain why the climate was getting wetter. Climate goes up and down, and one of the reasons for the encroachment of the desert into grasslands, both up in North Africa and here in West Africa, is that if you keep the same amount of rainfall but allow the land to erode or overgraze it with goats, it is possible to destroy the vegetation, and so the vegetation, instead of being a useful type of grass, becomes a useless type of shrub. So there is this change in vegetation. There are also places where sand drifts over grass and covers it up, depending upon the prevailing winds, of course. Coming back to the answer to the questions, what's being done on reclaiming the desert or reforesting it, I'm afraid I haven't read any recent reports of improving pasture lands in the western part of Africa. There are some things going on in the Republic of South Africa, have been for many years. This is one of the, you might say, small things that could be done, because we have had places in the world, such as Argentina, where almost the whole natural grass was replaced by other types from North America, providing a great boost to animal husbandry. I think the same thing could be done in some parts of Africa. Do you have another question? All right, the lady here.
How is the general amount of food for subsistence living in Africa?
The question is, what's the general level of food for subsistence living? I'd say generally inadequate, most parts of Africa. If we take the studies of the calories consumed by many of African populations, there is a lack of just amount of food. There's also a big problem of protein deficiency. This is something I left out of my paper I can put in now. You're giving me the chance. The tsetse fly not only causes these problems I've mentioned, but since there are no animals, the areas of Africa that have the tsetse fly suffer from a protein deficiency. And the people do ship in fish, and they do try to use vegetable types of protein. But they do suffer from kwashiorkor and other diseases that are caused by diet deficiency. On the other hand, the people that live where they do have animals are better situated when it comes to protein. They do have meat and milk. So a number of people are working on this particular problem. Have another question? Yes.
Are medical biologists done any work in developing toxins and serums or building up resistance to nargana in domesticated animals in Africa?
Yes. The question is, has something been done to develop serums or other things that can help in dealing with nagana? I am not a veterinarian, but from my veterinarian friends, I gain the information that there still is no practical vaccination against nagana. But there are medicines that can be injected into the animal that prevents it from getting the disease for a short period of time. That is, this is a little bit like taking a shot of penicillin, so when you scratch your finger, you won't get infection from it. It isn't a real preventive, but it is a method of providing the animal with the medicine beforehand so it doesn't get sick if it's bitten. And this has been developed to the extent where in places like northern Nigeria, they can move cattle from one area that is fly-free to another area through an infected area. That is, they can shoot all the animals full of medicine and move them across. There are some short-term preventive medicines that are expensive and impractical for nagana. Another thing that has been tried is the breeding of animals that are more resistant to the disease, and in East Africa there are a number of types of zebu cattle that do not get it as commonly as the European types. And of course, the going full way, the answer would be the thing I mentioned of using animals that are edible but that are not affected at all by the disease. I have another question. How about taking one from over here?
You mentioned the fine railroads in the Republic of the Congo. Were they manned by Europeans, or were their natives trained for the operation of the railroad?
The question is on the railways in the Congo as to whether they are operated by Europeans or by Africans. In the Congo, Africans were trained up to a fairly high level. I used to see African engineers, for example, but the higher administration was all European. The general story in the Congo when it comes to technical help is that I think the Belgians did a good job by African standards on primary education. I think they did a good deal on technical education in the lower grades, but there was a great neglect in the higher ranks along all lines of work. In the Army, for example, where the highest ranking man was only a sergeant. And the railway, I imagine the same thing would apply, that there'd be no administrators, but there could be some coalmen, brakemen, and so on. Workers along the right-of-way were Africans ordinarily.
Is it in operation now?
The last story I had on the railway in the Congo was that portions were operating here and there, but there was no unified system. Just 2 weeks ago, I read some report that they were going to try to get them to operating again. There's a great deal of confusion in the Congo. I have a geologist friend who went to several African countries to see how they were making out on geological mapping, which is a necessary prerequisite to discovering the minerals. He found in Nigeria things were going very well, but he was very depressed when he went to the Congo because they had a geological department with the government with over 100 people working, none of whom were geologists, not a single geologist in the whole group. Now, it may be politically necessary to hire all these people to stay in power or to keep them satisfied. So far as I know, they were the only activity of much importance was the mailing out of geological publications, which the Belgians had done before they left. Don't get me off onto the Congo. This is a whole new problem. I hope they can solve their administrative and political difficulties so they can get on with the economic development problems. All right.
Yeah, what can the United States do to help develop the resources in Africa?
Well, the question is, what can the United States to help do in developing resources in Africa? I might point out that one of the advantages African countries have now is that expert advice is available. They can hire experts from other places in the world. They can also get help from international agencies, and some of the African countries seem to be skilled in getting economic help from both the East and the West at the same time. So there are these opportunities now. When it comes to what the United States can do, I'm not familiar with too many of the AID projects, but I know a number of them are operating in Africa. I'm more familiar with the work of the Peace Corps because we've had a number of projects here. In the way of small development, I'd like to put in a plug for the 24 men who are now in Sierra Leone on rural development. As an example of some of the things can be done just with local funds and local support. We have the building of schools, the putting in of bridges and culverts, and the providing of water supply. As an example on water supply, if you can imagine that this is a mountainous area here, and that there are a number of villages at lower elevations, it's often possible to just go back to a spring in the mountain, lay a pipe from the spring to the village, put in a water spout, and then instead of the women having to climb 2 or 3 miles up the mountain every day to carry water back, all you have to do is just turn on the faucet. And this only takes a Peace Corps worker with a reasonably good, well-developed ability as a plumber and amateur geologist to hunt out these places, and this has been done in a number of villages. On the building of roads, there are a number of places in Sierra Leone where the country is a plateau. The area has very heavy rainfall. The streams cut down very sharp creeks, say 15 feet wide, 15 feet deep. The traditional way of providing bridges is to cut down some oil palm trees, put across perhaps 8 or 10 palm logs. This provides a very thrilling bridge to cross in a heavily laden truck, because you take a 5-ton truck and you cross one of these palm log bridges. You try to get both front wheels on good strong logs, and then these logs curve way down as you go across, and of course the logs on either side keep you from falling off. But eventually the logs get rotten and they lose a truck in the stream. There are a number of villages that have these palm log bridges. I visited one earlier this year where the Department of Public Works had put in concrete abutments at both ends. This was about a 30-foot creek at about 20 feet deep. They didn't have enough money to go any further. There was a Peace Corps boy who went to this particular area, saw the bridge, went to the local villages, was able to get the village councils in these places to raise enough money to buy 2 steel beams to go across. They cost $150 each. The villages raised the $300. The villagers provided the labor, took a few sacks of cement for the concrete. This place now has 2 steel beams and a concrete platform on top. The village is no longer cut off from the rest of the world. This took less, I'd say, than $400, plus imagination and local initiative. There are a number of these things can be done in the way of self-help. This doesn't increase the income tremendously, but it does make life better for people from place to place. Building schools is another one, where a number of villages have built their own schools. So I think the Peace Corps, in providing secondary school teachers for countries that had very few, and working on some of these development projects, has done very well. Some things in the Peace Corps have not worked well. I'd like to look at the ones that have worked. All right, there's a woman in the back. Yes, it's still a great problem. Somebody may not have heard the question. It's what is done with the great numbers of people that go from the rural areas to the cities. When I come to a problem like this, I think you have to take the problem and put it in perspective with others. In Kenya, I remember about 8 years ago, I saw 4 studies on development for Kenya. One was on housing. In order to take care of the people who come in from the country, it would take a tremendous amount of money to provide good housing. This was one project. There were many roads that were needed. This was a second project. Schools were needed. That was a third project. There were a number of things could be done in agriculture. This was a fourth one. The surprising thing about it was that each of the 4 projects would take the total resources of the country, so you could do one of the 4. I think often this amounts to try to do the one, concentrate on the one that will have the greatest long-term benefit, and try to develop the country. So you might invest in agriculture and roads, do something on housing, but if you just provide housing without increasing the opportunities for people in employment and so forth, you haven't solved your problem. This gets into the many difficulties of urban sociology, anthropology, social welfare, and so on. Perhaps as a general answer as to what's being done for the people coming to the cities is to say not enough, but I think some people overemphasize the drift to the cities. This happens in some countries and it doesn't in others. There's a great deal of migration in Africa, and if you take a country like Uganda, you find, for example, that there's a productive agricultural area over here raising sugar cane and tea. It draws workers from many places in Uganda, nearby countries. There's another area about here where local products for the city nearby, Kampala is raised along with, these vegetables are raised along with cotton and coffee. This also attracts a great number of people. There's still another group of people that flow over to the west where there is some farming in the way of coffee and tea up high in the mountains, and then the copper mines. These patterns of migrations and the drifting to places of employment are characteristic of Africa. I just pointed out the situation in one country. However, this is a constantly fluctuating situation. I've heard an estimate by a geologist that the copper mines, for example, in western Uganda are likely to disappear in 10 or 20 years. That is, they get down to levels where they can no longer mine them. This would do away with some of that migration. On the other hand, Kampala, the new capital of Uganda, keeps increasing in size. There is some increase of employment in manufacturing nearby, but I would guess that cities like this will have the problem of people who come to the city and have difficulties finding housing and jobs for a long time to come. All right. question is, to what extent is revenue from petroleum being used to raise standards of living in the oil-producing countries? Well, the situation in the biggest producing country, Algeria, is that with the flight of the French people from vineyards and manufacturing establishments and stores and so forth, Algeria was left with, something like 4 million people out of about 10 that had to be supported, and they had to get outside aid from many different ways. So far, the amount of income that's obtained from petroleum in Algeria is not enough to make up the needs of the country, that is, to make up the losses that have been occasioned by independence and the general disturbance of the economic system. Over a period of time, when it recovers, then this would provide a means for development. In the case of Libya, a great deal of the money from petroleum has been put into education. Libya has the problem that it's a desert country. Something can be done in agriculture, but not a great deal. I would say that probably investment in education is a reasonably good solution so far as Libya is concerned. The other countries don't have a great deal in the way of income from petroleum. Nigeria, it's still a modest amount, same way with Angola. Egypt doesn't produce enough petroleum for their own use yet, I don't believe, so I don't believe they're exporting any. I might take one more question. All right.
To what extent are the natural resources owned and controlled by outside investors?
This is a good question. To what extent are outside resources owned by outsiders? The picture is that African countries are taking charge of the resources rapidly. I gave you the example of the Gezira scheme, which was started by the British government, 2 private companies, and then the farmers shared in the profits of the whole enterprise. This was taken over, nationalized in 1950. I think the general situation is that where outsiders own farmland, as in Algeria or Kenya, in this day and with the present trend of events, these people can expect that the governments will either just expropriate the land or buy them out. Tunisia, for example, bought out French farmers, a large numbers of them. So in the case of land, most of the Africans have the view that the land not only belongs to them, but to their ancestors, to their group as a whole. It's sort of a family cultural situation to begin with. Sometimes they do come to take our view of land, that you can buy and sell it. But generally among the Africans on land, I would say that the attitude is more like the one I have at home, where I have a room that I give to my son, but if I go away for a few weeks, my son cannot sell that room to a neighbor. I might want to use it for grandmother or his sister. It's still in the family. And this is sort of the African attitude toward land. In the case of mineral resources, the new agreements that are being made by African governments provide more favorable terms to the Africans. So there still are foreign companies that operate in tropical African countries, but whenever there's a new arrangement made, the African country comes out better than it did before.
I wonder if I might remind you of a lecture which comes next Monday, Professor William Wilmers, and the topic is language, the problems of communication in a multilingual context. I'm sure I express our appreciation by thanking Professor Thomas for a very informative, fine evening.